So now that we've created a pizza calculator using computed and observed properties, I want to set you a challenge to build your own computed paint calculator. So go ahead and create a brand new playground and delete all of the code other than import foundation. Now we're going to create a variable called width, and this is going to be a float. And we're going to start it off with, say, 1.5. So we have a wall that has a width of 1.5 meters. Now, the next thing we're going to create is a variable called height, and it again is going to be a float, and this is going to be 2.3 meters. So we've got a wall that is 1.5 by 2.3. And now I want to be able to work out the number of buckets of paint that I need in order to cover this wall with paint. So let's say that a single bucket of paint only covers 1.5 meters squared area. Then can you use what we've learned about computed properties, create a computed property called buckets of paint, such that whenever I try to print buckets of paint, then it should be able to show me the updated number of buckets I need to buy in order to cover my wall with this width and height. So have a think about how you would achieve that, and pause the video and complete the challenge. Now let's leave this print statement down here so that once it works, then all of the errors will go away. But let's go ahead and define our computed property. Now, buckets of paint is going to be an integer because usually they only sell buckets of paint in entire buckets, right? So inside here, we're going to set the getter for our property. And we're going to first work out the area that we need to cover. And area is, of course, worked out by width being multiplied by height. And now we have our area. Now, previously we said that per bucket of paint, it covers 1.5 meters squared of area. So area covered per bucket to equal a float that is 1.5 meters squared. Now, next, we can calculate the number of buckets we need by saying let number of buckets to equal the total area we need to cover divided by area covered per bucket. And now we can return this number of buckets as the value of our property buckets of paint. Now, there's just one problem, because the number of buckets is an integer, whereas this has been working with floats. So we need to convert this into an integer, and we can do that by just directly casting it. Now, there's one other problem that you might have spotted. You can see that from our calculations, the number of buckets required is 2.3. But when we turn it into an integer, our float gets rounded down into 2. Now, that doesn't really work because if we need 2.3 buckets to cover our wall with paint, 2 buckets will leave some parts uncovered. So instead of rounding down, in this case, we actually always need to round up. So even if we only need 2.3 buckets, we actually have to go and buy 3 buckets. So what we can do is we can use ceiling. And what ceiling does is it will round up a number, either a double or a float. So in this case, between ceil F, we're going to put our number of buckets, which at the moment is 2.3, and that gets rounded up into 3, and that is what we're going to be turning into an integer, and that is what we're going to be returning as the value of our buckets of paint property. So now when we say print buckets of paint, we get 3 buckets printed down here. And if we decide to paint a different wall, say something that is, 3.4 meters by 2.1, then automatically this will get updated and we now need to buy 5 buckets of paint instead. Now, part 2 of this challenge is, what if we had a couple of buckets lying around in the house? And I want to know what is the total area that this paint can cover. So can you pause the video and write the setter for our buckets of paint property such that when I set bucket of paint, to say, I don't know, I've got 4 buckets lying around. I want to be able to print down here, this amount of paint can cover an area of X square meters, where X is worked out depending on how many buckets of paint we've got. So pause the video now and complete this part of the challenge. Okay, so as we mentioned before, at the moment, our buckets of paint is a read-only property, or what they call a get-only property, because we haven't specified a setter. So let's add that in there. Now, when this property gets set, as it is down here on line 21, we want to be able to work out the area that these number of buckets of paint can cover. So let's say let area can cover is equal to the new value that this property is being set to multiplied by 1.5, which remember is the area that can be covered per bucket of paint. So now we've got another problem. So when we click on this error, it tells us that you cannot multiply an integer with a double. So in order to fix this, we're going to have to change this new value, which at the moment, remember, is an integer, to a double. So we can cast it straight into a double, and now we're comparing like with like, and we're multiplying double with a double. So we now have an area that's worked out from the new value that this property gets set to, and we can now use a print statement to output some text. This amount of paint can cover an area of, area can cover. So now when I change this value, the number of buckets we have lying around, then you can see automatically our setter gets triggered and it tells us the amount or the area that can be covered using the buckets that we have lying around. Now you can see, even though at the moment we're using print statements and it's kind of a contrived example, but it's not difficult to see how you can output this into a UI element, say a label or the title of a button, and you can use the getter to dynamically work out the value of a property. And this is really, really useful in cutting down on unnecessary functions and methods that you're writing all over the place. And it also makes your code a lot easier to maintain, because in most cases, you don't really want to have to go into the getter and setter. And all you need to do is to set or change certain properties in a couple of places, and the rest will get updated automatically.